Welcome back to Dark Domain, where every shadow hides a secret and every whisper is a warning. Tonight we have 3 unsettling stories that will leave you questioning what's really out there. Before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more terrifying tales that will keep you on edge. And as you listen, let us know in the comments. Have you ever experienced something you just can't explain? Cold lies. If you live in Fairbanks long enough, you get used to the isolation. You grow comfortable with the idea that the wilderness is always watching you, that the cold can swallow you whole if you're not careful. Most of the year we live in darkness here, but it's not the dark that scares me anymore. My name is Ethan Crowley, and for the past 10 years I've been part of a research team based at the University of Alaska. We study extreme weather patterns, tracking the ways climate change is reshaping the Arctic. It's not the most exciting work, but it pays the bills and keeps me close to the mountains I've loved since I was a kid. But something changed last month, something I can't explain. It started with a discovery at one of our remote research stations, about 150 miles north of Fairbanks. Our team had been monitoring ice core samples from the tundra, looking at carbon levels trapped in the permafrost. Routine work. Nothing out of the ordinary. But when one of our colleagues, Dr. Neil Abbott, didn't report back from the station for 2 days, we sent a team to check on him. What they found didn't make sense. Abbott was dead, his body frozen solid despite the heat inside the station being cranked up to full blast. His skin had turned a strange shade of blue, almost translucent, and there were deep, jagged marks on his arms and neck, like something had clawed at him from the inside. The official cause of death was hypothermia, but that didn't explain the wounds. The look of sheer terror frozen on his face. It didn't explain the fact that all of his research data had been wiped clean. Every hard drive, every notebook gone. A few days later, I was called in to investigate. Our team was small, just me, Dr. Claire Howard, and Steve Nilsson, a technician who had been working with us for years. We were flown out to the station by helicopter, a rickety old thing that struggled against the wind as we made our way north. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting long, dim shadows across the endless white tundra. When we arrived, the station felt like a tomb. The air inside was thick, stifling, despite the heaters still running at full capacity. The walls were covered in frost, and the smell of something rotten lingered in the small, cramped rooms. Claire immediately got to work analyzing the samples that Abbott had been studying before he died. I went through what little remained of his research logs, but most of it was useless. There were only fragments of notes, scattered thoughts about something he had found deep in the ice, something ancient. That night, as the wind howled outside, I started feeling uneasy. There was something about the station, the way the cold seemed to press in on all sides, that made it hard to breathe. The isolation was suffocating. Steve, who'd always been the quiet type, was jittery, pacing around the small common area like he was waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I heard Claire call for me from the lab. When I got there, she was staring at one of the ice core samples under the microscope, her face pale. "Ethan, you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling. I leaned over and peered into the microscope, adjusting the focus. What I saw didn't make sense. There, buried inside the ice, was something moving. It looked like a small, writhing organism, worm-like but far too large to be a simple parasite. It was alive, trapped in the ice for who knows how many thousands of years, and now, it was thawing. "This is impossible," I muttered, shaking my head. "Nothing should be able to survive that long in ice." "That's what I thought," Claire said, stepping back from the microscope. "But it's real, and if Abbott found this, it might explain what happened to him." We spent the next few hours debating what to do. We couldn't just leave, not without more answers. But as the night dragged on, something changed. Steve, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly stood up, his face twisted in anger. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, pacing again. "This place, there's something wrong with it." I tried to calm him down, but it was like he wasn't listening. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, like he was seeing something none of us could. "There's something in the ice," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's alive, and it's trying to get out." Claire and I exchanged a worried glance. We'd both seen the organism in the sample, but it was still frozen. It couldn't have affected Steve, could it? That's when the power went out. The lights flickered, and then everything went dark. The heaters stopped, the air growing colder by the second. The only sound was the wind outside, howling louder than before, as if it was trying to tear the station apart. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the generator room, with Claire close behind me. Steve stayed behind, muttering to himself as he rocked back and forth in his chair. When we reached the generator, we found the wires ripped out, shredded like they'd been gnawed on. There was no way we could fix it. As we stood there in the freezing dark, a low growl echoed through the station. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, closer this time. It wasn't the wind. Something was moving inside the station. Claire grabbed my arm, her face pale. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my breath fogging in the cold air. "But we need to find Steve and get out of here." We made our way back to the common area, our footsteps echoing in the silence. But when we got there, Steve was gone. His chair was overturned, and there were deep scratch marks on the floor, leading toward the back of the station. My stomach twisted as I followed the trail, my flashlight flickering in the cold. The trail led to the storage room, the door hanging open. Inside, the temperature had dropped even further, the air biting against my skin. And there in the corner was Steve. He was crouched on the floor, his back to us, his arms wrapped around his body as he shivered violently. His skin had turned the same strange blue as Abbott's, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He turned to face us, and I recoiled. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and his mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. His skin, now translucent, seemed to pulse with something beneath the surface. Something moving. "They're inside," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're in the ice. And now, they're in me." Before we could react, Steve lunged at us, his body moving with unnatural speed. I barely had time to shove Claire out of the way as Steve crashed into the wall, snarling like a rabid animal. We ran, my heart pounding in my chest as the sound of Steve's crazed growls echoed through the station. Whatever had been in the ice, whatever had killed Abbott, was now inside Steve, and it was coming for us. We barricaded ourselves in the lab, pushing furniture against the door as the temperature continued to drop. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my bones, making it hard to think. "We have to stop it," Claire said, her voice shaking. "We have to destroy whatever's in the ice." I nodded, knowing she was right. But getting to the sample meant going back out there, back to where Steve was. The growling outside the door had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I didn't know if that was better or worse. "I'll go," I said, my breath visible in the freezing air. "You stay here. If I'm not back in 10 minutes... Claire didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes wide with fear. I made my way back through the dark hallways, my flashlight flickering in and out. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. When I reached the lab, the ice core sample was still there, sitting on the table, the organism frozen inside. I grabbed it, wrapping it in a thick cloth to keep it from thawing any further. But as I turned to leave, I saw Steve standing in the doorway. His eyes gleamed with a sickening hunger, his body twitching as he took a step toward me. "Give it to me," he rasped, his voice barely human. "It's part of me now. It's in all of us." I backed away, my hands trembling. "Steve, this isn't you." But there was no reasoning with him. Whatever had infected him, whatever had come from the ice, had taken over completely. I ran. I don't know how I made it out of there alive. The next thing I remember, I was outside, stumbling through the snow as the first rays of daylight broke through the clouds. I had the sample with me, but Steve was gone. They airlifted Claire and me back to Fairbanks that morning. The station has been shut down. classified as a biohazard. No one's allowed near it anymore. The official report says Abbott and Steve died from hypothermia, but I know better. I saw what was inside them. I saw what came out of the ice. And now, every time I close my eyes, I hear the growling. I feel the cold. It's still out there, waiting. Dead air. I always thought Bismarck was a quiet city. Nothing ever really happened here, not beyond the usual run-of-the-mill crimes you'd expect in a place this size. But last month, everything changed. I didn't think something like this could happen in a place like mine. My name is Calvin Gray, and I'm a radio host for one of those late-night call-in shows. You know the type. Local news, talk radio, the occasional conspiracy theorist calling in to rant about Bigfoot sightings. I've heard it all over the years, but nothing prepared me for that night. The night the calls started coming in, one after the other. It was just after 11 p.m., and I was gearing up for another slow evening on air. Most of the time, it was the usual crowd, truck drivers passing through, insomniacs looking for some company, a few regulars who like to hear themselves talk, the kind of people who don't sleep much. But that night, something was off. It started with a woman, her voice shaky, barely above a whisper. "Calvin, you need to help me." I leaned into the microphone, my eyebrows furrowing. "Ma'am, what's going on? Where are you?" She hesitated, her breath ragged. "I don't know. I can't get out." I sat up straighter, glancing over at the producer, Tom, who was already looking at me with a concerned expression. "Okay, just breathe. Can you tell me where you are? What do you mean you can't get out?" There's something here," she whispered. "It's in the radio. I can hear it, in the static." The line went dead. I took off my headset, looking at Tom. "Did we just lose the call?" He shook his head. "No, she hung up. The signal was fine." For a moment, I sat there in silence, the hum of the radio equipment filling the room. I didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't uncommon for people to call in, worked up about something, but this was different. There was real fear in her voice. Before I could say anything, the phone rang again. I took the call, and the voice on the other end was a man this time, his words rushing out in a panicked mess. "They're coming through the airwaves, man. You have to stop them. The static, it's not just noise. It's something else. It's alive." I tried to calm him down, but he wasn't listening. He just kept rambling about voices in the static, how they were speaking to him, how they were telling him to do things. Terrible things. The line crackled with distortion, and for a moment I thought I heard something faint, like a whispering voice in the background. It was so soft, barely audible beneath the man's frantic breathing. Then the call cut off again. I sat there, my heart pounding, unsure of what to say. Something was happening, something strange, and I had no idea how to stop it. Over the next hour, the calls kept coming. Each one was more disturbing than the last. People from all over the city, calling in with the same story, hearing voices in the static, feeling like they were being watched. Some of them said they couldn't leave their homes, like something was keeping them inside, something unseen. One woman screamed into the phone begging for help, saying that her daughter had vanished from her room without a trace. Another man, his voice trembling, claimed he saw shadows moving through his house, but when he turned on the lights, nothing was there. And in every call, there was the same eerie underlying detail, the static. Whatever was happening, it seemed to be coming through the radio. I couldn't explain it. I didn't believe in ghosts or demons or any of the paranormal stuff people like to call in about on slow nights. But this felt different. It wasn't just a few people, it was dozens. And the fear in their voices? That was real. I turned to Tom, who was pale as a sheet, listening to each call with growing horror. "We need to shut this down," I said, pulling off my headset. "Something's happening. We have to stop the broadcast." But before Tom could respond, the phone rang again. This time I didn't pick it up. The phone rang once, twice, and then it stopped. For a second there was silence, and I thought maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had been happening had stopped. Then the static came through the speakers. It wasn't just the normal low hum of background noise. It was louder, almost like it was pushing through the airwaves, filling the room. I stared at the console, my pulse quickening as the static grew louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. And beneath it, just barely audible, I heard a voice. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then it grew clearer. It wasn't speaking in words I could understand, but I felt it deep in my bones. The voice was cold, detached, like it was calling out from somewhere far away. Somewhere dark. The lights in the studio flickered, and Tom stood up, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." I didn't argue. We rushed out of the studio, the static still crackling behind us, louder than ever. As we reached the exit, I glanced back at the control room, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure, shadowy and indistinct, standing just beyond the glass, watching us. We got out of the building and into the parking lot, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. The whole city seemed to be wrapped in a strange, oppressive silence, like the air itself was holding its breath. "We need to warn people," Tom said, his voice shaking. "Tell them to turn off their radios." But how? How could we stop something that was coming through the very thing people trusted to keep them informed, entertained? It was everywhere. Every car, every home, every portable radio playing quietly in the background. Over the next few days, reports started coming in from all over the city. People were hearing things in the static. Voices, strange noises, whispers that wouldn't stop. Some claimed they could see things, shadowy figures moving in the corners of their vision, vanishing the moment they turned their heads. And then the disappearances started. Dozens of people went missing, seemingly vanishing from their homes, their cars, without a trace. It was as if the city itself was swallowing them whole, pulling them into some invisible void. The police were baffled. The media was in a frenzy, but no one had any answers. All I knew was that the static hadn't stopped. It was still out there, filling the airwaves, creeping into people's minds, taking something from them. And whatever it was growing stronger. I quit the show after that night. I couldn't go back to the studio, couldn't sit in front of that microphone again, knowing what might be waiting on the other end. The voices, the static, they were still there, lurking just below the surface, waiting for someone to tune in. Every now and then I still hear it, late at night, when the city is quiet and the air is thick with silence. I'll hear the faint hum of static coming through the walls, like it's trying to find a way in. And I know that if I listen too closely, I might hear the voice again. The voice that doesn't belong in our world. Whispers in the walls. You ever wonder what's hiding behind the walls? Not in the cracks or the pipes, but deeper, where you can't see. I never used to. I was just an average guy, working as an electrician in Cleveland, Ohio, and the only thing I cared about was making sure the lights turned on when you flipped a switch. That all changed when I got the call to work on the old O'Connell building. My name's James, by the way. James O'Leary. I've been doing electrical work for over 20 years, but I've never seen anything like what I found in that building. The O'Connell place was an office building back in the 70s, long abandoned and set to be converted into luxury apartments. The developers brought me in to update the wiring. Simple job, or so I thought. The building was a mess. Half the windows were boarded up and the inside was coated with decades of dust and mold. The air was thick, musty, like the place hadn't breathed in years. As I walked the halls, my footsteps echoed, a reminder that no one had been there in a long time. The first few days on the job were uneventful, just crawling through crawl spaces, pulling old wires, replacing them with new ones. I didn't think much of the place's history. But then I started hearing things. It began with whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind whistling through cracks in the walls, Old buildings creak, moan, and make all kinds of noises. But this was different. The whispers weren't random. They were deliberate. Like voices, too faint to make out the words, but close enough to know they were there. I shrugged it off. I was alone in a building with bad insulation. Of course I'd hear weird things. But then it got worse. One afternoon, I was working on the 4th floor, pulling wires through the walls, when I heard it again. This time, the whisper was clearer. It was coming from behind the wall. Not just the usual creaking, but a voice. A low, raspy voice, like someone was standing right behind me.
Help me.
I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I ripped off my gloves and pressed my ear to the wall. The voice was faint, muffled, but it was there.
Please, help.
My stomach dropped. I backed away, staring at the plaster, trying to wrap my head around what I'd just heard. It couldn't be real. There was no way someone was in the wall. But the voice, it was so clear. I grabbed a hammer from my tool belt and hesitated for just a second before swinging at the plaster. The drywall crumbled easily, revealing the wooden beams beneath. I ripped the plaster away, creating a hole large enough to see inside. There was nothing there, just the hollow space between the walls. But the voice didn't stop.
Help.
It was louder now, coming from somewhere further inside the wall. I dropped the hammer, crawling into the narrow gap. The air was cold, damp, and I could feel the moisture seeping through the cracks in the brick. I followed the sound, crawling deeper into the darkness. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. I was sweating now, my hands shaking as I crawled toward the source. The tunnel twisted, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. The voice was just ahead, just a little further. Then I saw it, a small wooden door hidden behind the beams. It was old, rotting, barely hanging on its hinges. The voice was coming from behind it. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pulled the door open. Inside was a small room, dark, silent. The walls were lined with old pipes and the floor was covered in dust and debris. But the thing that caught my attention, the thing that made my blood run cold, was the chair in the center of the room. A chair with restraints. My mind raced. I had no idea what this place was or why it was hidden behind the walls. But I knew one thing. This wasn't part of the original construction. Suddenly, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it made my ears ring. I wanted to run to get out of that place and never look back, but something kept me there. Something was pulling me deeper into the darkness. That's when I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight down the narrow tunnel, but there was nothing there, just the darkness stretching on and on. But the footsteps kept coming, closer. Panicking, I crawled back through the hole, scrambling to get out. The footsteps followed, echoing through the walls. I could feel something behind me, breathing down my neck, reaching for me. I burst out of the crawl space, gasping for air, and slammed the hole shut behind me. The room was still, silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I grabbed my tools and left the building that day. I didn't care about the job anymore. I didn't care about the paycheck. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. But it didn't end there. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. Faint but unmistakable. It was coming from inside my house, from behind the walls. I tore the place apart, ripping open the drywall, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing. No hidden rooms, no old chairs, no one hiding in the walls. Just the whispers. They've followed me ever since. Everywhere I go, they're there, just on the other side of the walls, calling to me. I don't know what I found in the O'Connell building. Maybe it was something from the past, something buried deep in those walls for a reason. But whatever it was, it found me. And now it won't let me go. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey into the unknown. From the coldest corners to the darkest walls, these stories remind us that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't see, but they're always there. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next unsettling story. Until next time, sleep tight. if you can.